So I think the first thing I want to say is this is obviously a moment in time when many of us feel helpless, many of us feel that we don't have a voice, many of us don't know what to do, and feel depressed and discouraged. And I often think of the remark of the philosopher Theodore Adorno, who said, at any moment in time, the most that any one person can possibly do is to become conscious of his or her own responsibility. So my first thought, Ronit, is I'm grateful to you for becoming conscious of your responsibility as someone who lived in Chicago and someone whose environment you made a film about and who just decided not to walk by it every day, but to actually think about it. So I think that's wonderful. So I would ask people to join me in giving Ronit a round of applause. My second thought is, for a very long time, the villain in public housing was thought to be the high-rise form. For many decades, people would say the problem with public housing is the high-rise. If the buildings had not been 15 or 16 or 17 or 18, 19 stories high, there would not have been any problems. And then people began to realize that there were high-rises in Manhattan, which we have to admit is a kind of urban exception. The rules of Manhattan don't really seem to apply anywhere else. There are very special urban conditions about that city that don't seem to translate elsewhere. But I guess I would ask you, one thing the film doesn't really talk about is architecture. And when you think about the high-rise form, and to what extent do you understand it is responsible for some of the problems that this community experienced?
In terms of the architecture, it's a hard one for me to answer because I'm not an architect, but I've read a lot about the pros and the cons of the buildings. And it's really hard for me to know whether it is the fact that these were high-rises, that they weren't maintained. Brad Hunt has a book called Blueprint for Disaster. He says it's because there were so many children in the high-rise. It was not designed for so many children. The elevators broke. So I really don't have a good answer in terms of was it the high-rise, but I always circle back to the stigmatization of the people that lived there. And to me, it's like whether or not another form would have been better, why was everybody so stigmatized within there? I can say that the buildings themselves, not necessarily the height of them, but the actual construction was very cold. It was very industrial feeling, very much like, say, a jail or institution. The walls were cinder block, and that never lent itself to a sense of warmth for me as an outsider. Again, didn't live there, don't know what it was like to live in there, but my impressions was that it was such an institutional feel. And I always thought it would have been nicer if these were designed with some more warmth. Deirdre talks about, when she's asked about whether it was the high-rise structure at fault, she always says the one thing that we never had in the front was security. And that if you go to many high-rise buildings, there'll be a door person and doing security. So that's what she wanted for her building. So it's a question that I ponder a lot. It's a good question.
The other point one usually comes across in the literature is that an important deficiency of these housing projects was the fact that the street pattern was cut off from the rest of the city, and you don't have an ordinary block with stores and with urban life, but this type of housing represents a kind of spatial segregation of people from the rest of the city. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I know that model where this is supposed to be people were cut off, but the thing is really, yes, there were some streets that never went anywhere, but on the periphery there were a lot of stores. So Cabrini wasn't as isolated as people really make it sound to be, because it's right in the city center, you just cross the street. But the one thing that was lacking was sort of some of the good stores in terms of, it was a food desert, we didn't have good grocery stores at that time. They've now built a library. So the amenities around it weren't great. I wouldn't say it's necessarily a fault of the grid, though. The grid, I don't think, particularly at Cabrini, was the isolating factor.
I see people who want to raise their hands and ask questions. So, you, sir?
Yeah. If you look at the west side of Chicago, that is also a predominantly African-American region of the city. And it is hardly high-rises. It is brownstones running down Washington Boulevard, Van Buren, the works, straight out from Madison Street, to the west. It has problems of light up and down and sideways and everything else. And yet it's more manageable than the high-rise experiments in Chicago. Now, I know New York reasonably well also, and the high-rises there are simply built better, in my opinion. And the high-rises, for example, in Cabrini Green, really, in my judgment, were not built very well. I have no credentials whatsoever in architecture or anything like it, but I did grow up and see all of those places, and I saw the fact that they needed a lot of help, and it was very hard to fix them up because of the way they were constructed. And I don't like fancy new architecture myself. I think you should steal from the past and other places that are stable and make things that work. But I do think that there's something to the argument that the wrong kind of high-rise is not a very good idea. It's not sustainable over a long period. There comes a natural lifetime, and then after that, goodbye. And I think that part was an experiment that didn't work. But if you look at other areas right within the city, so you don't have to compare demographics of one city to another, you can see that something better could have been done. You would have retained the community, retained the families, fixed the schools and everything else. And I think if you look at those parts, they have worked better. So, my view growing up in Chicago, right down the street from Cabrini Green, right where Nelson Algren wrote Man with a Golden Arm, is that it wasn't all bad that some of those were torn down, because one thing you didn't talk about a lot is the crime rate. And in the 60s, man, it was crime-ridden. There was no doubt about that. So it's kind of wonderful movie, but I don't know what to make of all the complex.
Yes.
Do you feel like us asking whether or not architecture can fix this in hindsight is kind of an insincere question about, like to me, it's coming off a little bit insincere because it's not recognizing, like, no amount of architecture is going to fix it if you hate a community. Like, does it feel insincere at all to you, or do you feel like architecture could have had some intervention earlier? Like, or how do we create architecture where we can create more love for that community or more connection so we don't feel so much otherness?
To me, nothing exists in a vacuum, so I don't actually see the question as insincere. I see it as trying to understand the puzzle, but there's many pieces to the puzzle. And buildings are one. Community, resources, institutionalized racism, like those are all the big pieces. And you can't address just physical structure without looking at all the social elements that come into play as well.
The film is good, I think, about mentioning the fact of deindustrialization, that the economy of Chicago was changing during this period of time, and that people were losing their jobs in the slaughterhouses and blue-collar sectors. And I think it's important to mention that and to recognize that even if you had built Le Corbusier glass boxes, people who are unemployed and who are suffering from the dislocation and economic downturn would probably not have fared any better. So one needs to recognize that architecture, I think, is only one factor in this situation, which, as the film, I think, eloquently suggests, involves a complex of social, political, economic, racial, demographic factors. And there's only so much one can expect architecture to accomplish in that context. Doctor, yes.
Thank you for making such a wonderful film. I guess my question for you is, you described sort of being an outsider coming from Montreal.
Yeah.
And perhaps do you feel that being an outsider coming into Chicago, did that give you perhaps develop a unique perspective, or perhaps are there any parallels where you came from that you felt maybe give you a specific lens about Cabrini Green when you made your film?
For me, being an outsider gave me an advantage because I didn't have a lot of the baggage in terms of the vilification of Cabrini Green. I didn't know anything about Cabrini. So I went in a way, I would say, I had a fresh lens. And so I think that was a good thing. You know, I didn't know the history. I hadn't known about the violence. Obviously, I know about racism and segregation, but I didn't know the specifics of this community. So a lot of people, my peers, would have been afraid to go to Cabrini. I wasn't afraid because I hadn't grown up with all the stereotypes on the news being blasted at me. So for me, the outsider perspective was a good thing and drew me into the community and got me continuing to make the film.
At one moment, one of the documentary clips mentions that the Italians and the Jews and the blacks were all prevented from living in certain neighborhoods. Did you find any evidence when you were making the film of any bond between people in those groups today? Does anything of that common exclusion still survive?
Well, the community was 99% African American, so I didn't really see any sort of, what's the word?
Residue or?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, although the barber, well, in my first film, George Robbins, the barber, there's a barber shop at Cabrini Green. So everybody Google voicesofcabrini.com, you can watch it for free. And he did talk about that. In his generation, he was elderly, and he talked about the blacks and Italians living together. And Mrs. Penny Money, I don't remember her exact name, lived down the street. And so the older folks did know and could talk about the sort of mixture of the community. But I did a lot of reading, and there's a good book by Larry Gale, and it's called Twice Removed. And he does talk about, there was a lot of animosity in that sense when it was Italian and black community in the 30s. He really documents some of that, some really bad racism that was happening towards the black community. But I didn't witness any sort of camaraderie between the groups.
I'm curious, there was a clip of Bobby Rush, the congressman from Chicago who grew up as a politician alongside former President Obama. He was a community organizer in Chicago. I'm wondering, did you uncover any observations around where the former president was during this period and what his actions were as a community organizer or state senator?
Yeah, questions about Bobby Rush and Obama. So when we were making this film, Obama wasn't around. He wasn't part of this organizing circle. I knew Michelle Obama because she was part of a group called Public Allies that she founded. So I knew her, and then I knew that she had a husband called Barack. So I knew of him through her. So, but Bobby Rush was somebody that was at every meeting. He was very, very, very involved in this fight to preserve public housing and more affordable housing. So he was at everything until he got sick. But Obama wasn't, and he may have been more on the south side, but he wasn't in the Cabrini sort of fight.
One of your residents actually mentioned something I think is very important, and this was really part of the design philosophy of public housing in the 30s, and that was you just didn't build buildings, you built buildings in a setting, and the setting was the open space. The open space was that's critical, that's the building. And one of the residents actually talked about what the original condition was, and that was it was well kept. And then you look at 30 years later, and you see, well, now the open space is a wasteland, which totally changes the setting of which the buildings are set in. And of course, we all, I think, understand that that's a maintenance question, i.e. the investment of money in that. But I think that is as much a question to be raised as the buildings themselves. If you look at public housing in LA, built in the 30s, they're only, 2 stories, not high rises, and they, to a certain extent, suffered the same kind of lack of maintenance, and they're in tremendous amounts of open space, but people then don't go in the open space because the open space is identified as having a use or a function. It's just this kind of leftover space. So
parties, they were really in the parking lot. So it's not as if, it's almost as if we've given in to not having any identifiable functional gathering space. Now we use other spaces in a way for that.
Well, I thought it was interesting in some of the new projects had wrought iron fences around them, right, protecting the open space,
Right.
which they look belongs to the building, not to the public. In a kind of different sense.
I appreciate the film, and I understand that the focus is not on the architecture, but I think that maybe this is a better architecture because now there's a variety of spaces which include the variety of incomes, whereas before it might have been too uniform and isolating from the real diversity of Chicago. So I think also yes, there was a loss, but I think that integration of society was the greater goal. And do you see it that way, or?
I see, in theory, that's what they wanted mixed income to be, but it's not being that way when it's played out. When Cabrini was first made, there was a diversity of incomes. And then as time went on, it became more unified in terms of more poor, less working class. But what's happening in the mixed income right now is that there's a gap between low income and high income, meaning there's people that are from former public housing are in the mixed income, and then you also have homeowners, but the prices are very high. You don't have the middle. It's missing the middle. And that, to me, is a big flaw in the system. This is a sort of engineered community that we're trying to make, and we're trying to make it mixed, but we really didn't. It's not. So I think that, unfortunately, the practice isn't working. I do see what you mean about it's sort of a space that it's maybe perhaps more inviting, but it's not being played out that way in actuality.
So maybe final comments?
One more question, perhaps? Is there students who, or I see a gentleman back there? I saw a hand.
I'm just actually trying to understand from a student's perspective, perhaps, what the takeaway is for this. Certainly, we're invited to make our own, come to our own conclusions about it and that sort of thing, other than the general sense that this didn't work out so well, et cetera, et cetera. And certainly, the students learn from who I go and modern history, contemporary history, that architecture has now decided is much more limited in what it can do in these situations. And what I notice in studios is that there is it's almost like a refusal for the students to recognize that and a desire to believe that they would actually be able to do something about these sort of things, and potentially the risk that they imagine architecture can do too much, can solve the problem. You suggest in the film and in the talk before this that architecture can do some things, but at the end of the day, it's a much more complex and multi-faceted problem. But I'm just wondering again, the architecture students looking at this, some of who might actually find themselves in a situation where they might be able to participate in this sort of thing. What they are to think, how could they imagine their role in improving this situation could be played out? Because that's, I kind of hear, it's impossible. You said, talk to the residents. That's a thing. Certainly they want to know who they're working for. But on the other hand, it's so complex, and the architecture piece of the puzzle is so small. But I have to, again, maybe as an old school architect, I feel like it's better that there's more possibility than that. So I guess I'm hoping for some word of hope at the end, some exhortation, that it's not impossible. That in fact architecture can participate, and we can believe that it can improve things.
You have a question here in the first one, sir?
As I addressed what you just said, Dwayne Williams, class of '94. One thing that I heard him say in the film that they didn't consider people with large families in the new. There's only just kind of a 2-bedroom or 1-bedroom or whatever flat. So some people couldn't move back in just because they had large families. That's directly architecture. If you had talked to the community before, you found out some things about that. There's others. But even with the idea that of gentrification, that's happening right now in our city. So with the development happening at Hollywood Park and around Crenshaw Baldwin's area as well. So
I think what Dwayne's bringing up for me is about knowing a lot of times different communities have different ways of living in architecture. Architects have to deal with developers' understanding of architecture, the users' understanding of architecture, and in a sense, what's happened, my ears were attuned to, often we mistake democratic processes for democratic outcomes, and often people set up in architecture are kind of the dog and pony show and a lot of these, quote, democratic kind of processes of showing what's going to happen and whatnot. And I think at some level you have to really make sure that the architecture is being measured by its outcomes, not necessarily the process used to make the architecture. And I think that not enough politicians, not enough developers, not enough developers make the architecture and then sell it, different model. So I think architects have to be reflective on their place within that system and how the architecture can be measured against them. Louis?
Just a quick comment, I guess, as a student. And I think one of the most disappointing things about kind of like the architecture pedagogy, yeah, that's the right word, right? Is kind of like we focus on design and kind of like what design can do, but it's always kind of like isolated from, or at least I guess from the way I kind of saw things or experienced it in the last 5 years. It's always kind of been isolated from the social political circumstances that are connected to it. And I mean, we design in this bubble that like design is supposed to be for design's purpose, and it's kind of like we ignore these issues. And I think maybe that's where kind of like there can be a change. Is like we have these general courses that USC kind of like requires us to take that they provide like this context, this general education of like what a good citizen is supposed to have, but they're never really guided and catered towards like how that can influence architecture, how that can add a benefit, rather than like taking a random philosophy class that you might sleep through. You can take a class that like adds some merit to the design process while implicating these political social issues within design.
For me, one of the great problems of public housing has always been that the people who designed it themselves wouldn't want to live there. So I don't really see the situation changing until architects and urbanists actually design buildings and communities where they themselves want to live. And they're not just thinking of it as something for other people, but they're thinking of it as something for themselves also. And they get excited about it. And I think when that starts to happen, maybe the problem will be mitigated a bit. One final question?
I think what we're asking is, how can we be better activists? And speaking to your history with activism, we have a certain, well, we're getting there with our education, or we're in the field, but we have a background and a privilege as architects that we can affect change, but we want to know, maybe it's attending design reviews in our communities, or maybe there's action that we can take today. And I don't know if in your telling of this story, if you came across people that were able to affect change in situations like that.
In terms of architecture?
Yeah, I mean, direct action well, I mean, not even in terms of architecture. Like,
It talks about the citizen architect, so in a sense it's taking that responsibility that you're not just, that you are of the community and you have to see it in that holistic way rather than singular.
Yeah, and I'm encouraged by all of you in this room and that we're having these discussions, and I don't think these discussions were being had 50 years ago. So I'm very, I have hope. I have hope that because because today we're asking these discussions, because today we have a legacy of what went wrong, it's documented, we can learn from that we won't make those same mistakes. It's always hard because you're also, as you know, as architects, working in a constraint of financial. Who's paying the bill here? And so public housing wasn't necessarily designed the way people wanted it to be designed because of the financial limitation. And that's always something to consider. But the fact that we are looking at this, I have hope that we can design for the future. I don't have the answers. I don't know. I wish I had an answer for people today. There isn't one. But there's continually trying to do the best you can when you move forward.
That seems like a good note on which to end. Please join me in thanking Ronit.